Welcome. I'm Theodosia Ford. My late husband, Colonel Ford, and I built this, our new home, in 1774. I was honored to have General Washington and his entire staff, including that engaging young officer, Hamilton, stay with me the terrible and cold winter of 1780. Do come in and enjoy seeing my home. Of course, much has changed since the General came to stay. My children and I are living here in the back of the house in one room where I have both my parlor and my bedroom. Was there activity here? General Washington was constantly busy, planning military strategy for the summer campaign, writing constantly to Congress to ask for money and food to help provide for those heroic soldiers staying in harsh conditions out in Jockey Hollow. Secretaries and aides rushed in and out of the general's office. The staff had their own quarters where they worked on correspondence. Our kitchen was large and usually adequate, but the general had an additional one built outside in order to provide for the crowds at the house.
Good afternoon. My name is Philip Gaffney. I am a trustee of the Washington Association of New Jersey, and I'm pleased to tell you about the high ground hill overlooking Morristown known as Fort Nonsense. This is one of 3 National Historic Sites in Morristown, also known as the military capital of the Revolution from 1778 to 1780. George Washington, of course, was housed at the Jacob Ford Mansion in Morristown, which is now George Washington headquarters. We're at the site of Fort Nonsense. 6 miles down the road is Jockey Hollow, where the 10,000 Continental Army troops were actually stationed in huts. It was a harsh winter, coldest on record in New Jersey, a lot of snow, a lot of bitter cold, and everybody was miserable, which is one reason why General William Howe, the commanding general of the British troops in New York, didn't want to attack because the weather conditions were so severe. Speaking of General Howe, there is a series of pyres, fire-burning pyres. One was in Elizabeth, the other was in Springfield, and the third was at Beacon Hill and Summit. There was something to let Washington and his generals know that Howe was coming out of New York to make an attack. Any case, that's the strategic importance of Fort Nonsense from a military standpoint. But this site here, Fort Nonsense, actually got its humorous comical name because in the inactivity of actually fighting, Washington wanted his troops to have something to do and keep them occupied. So this was what this site was about, having 50 troops here basically to keep busy. So it was like a nonsensical fort, if you will. So that's this site. It's an important one. We hope you find time to come up here on a beautiful day. Thank you.
Morristown and Washington's headquarters at Morristown National Historical Park witnessed the suffering and endurance of the soldiers of the American Continental Army and their leader, General George Washington. Here they struggled through the harsh winter of 1779-1780 to survive till spring so they could continue their fight for independence from Great Britain and for individual freedoms.
My name is Kenneth McKenzie, and I am proud to be a member of the Board of Trustees of the Washington Association of New Jersey. I'm standing in front of the museum in the Morristown National Park, and as I look up the walkway, I see the Ford Mansion. This property, including the mansion and the association's vast collection of colonial and Revolutionary War artifacts, were donated to the Morristown National Park shortly after the park was created by federal law in 1933. The architect of the museum was John Russell Pope. Pope's concept was to recreate the exterior image of Mount Vernon, George Washington's home in Virginia. Here we are in the American Style Gallery, We can see here how people lived during the time of the Revolutionary War. Included are articles of clothing, furniture, games, and other artifacts that relate to that period. Now we are in the military gallery, which is also known as the Winning Independence Room. Here we can see the tools of the soldiers' trade, including musketry, ammunition, cannons used in the artillery. My favorite piece is a large chain link that was part of an installation used to chain off the Hudson River from British invasion. This is the film room. Here on continuous display is the video entitled Morristown, Where America Survived. It tells the story of the difficult winter of 1779-1780 and the soldiers that had to endure the worst ever winter in New Jersey out in the field. Stand with George. This is the selfie corner. We are now in the Lloyd W. Smith collection room. Here we read pamphlets of protest, newspapers, rare books, irreplaceable items from the Revolutionary War period that tell the story of how and why the Patriots felt as fervently as they did for the cause of liberty and freedom.
Jockey Hollow was the site of an encampment of the Continental Army during the hard winter of 1779-1780. At its peak, this was one of the biggest cities in the country, with over 10,000 people living here. Henry Wick built this house about 1750. He owned a farm of over 1,400 acres, making him one of the biggest landowners in Morristown. Most of his land was covered with trees, which attracted Washington's army because they needed the wood to build log cabins and for firewood. Come in and take a look at the rooms. The orchards and the farmland. The vegetable and herb garden right next to the house. When the Army came here for the winter of 1779-1780, the soldiers had to build their own log cabins, and Washington was very strict with how they were to be constructed. Everyone had to be 14 foot wide, 16 foot long, and built in a straight line. And if they weren't built correctly, they'd be torn down and they'd have to start all over again. The men were experienced in building their huts, and they got them up within 2 weeks. Each one of these huts would hold 12 men, and this is where they would cook their food, where they would eat, and where they would sleep. Life in the winter camp was hard. Men went days without food. They lacked proper clothing, and it was the worst winter in recorded U.S. history. But despite all that, out of an army of over 10,000 men, less than 100 men died. The men endured so they could continue to fight for American independence and freedom.